Council of Europe Secretary General Thorbjørn Jagland arrived in Kyiv for a two-day visit with a new action plan for reforming Ukraine's judicial and prosecution systems, as well as decentralizing power. In an exclusive interview with Ukraine Today, Jagland speaks about problems with Ukraine's lustration law, constitutional reform, and about future plans for cooperation.
What exactly main changes do you see need to be done with the Ukrainian Constitution?
First of all, what is said about the role of the judiciary. That is extremely important, that it is said in the Constitution that the judiciary, the courts here, has to be independent and of course non-corrupted. One has to change what is said about the prosecutor general. What is said now in the Constitution is from the communist time, actually. And of course there is a need to also to get into the Constitution the need for decentralization of power, not only with regard to Donbass area, but I think there is a need for a devolution of power to the local authorities. And in that respect, I think also one needs to think about how to merge local communities, because there are so many local authorities here in Ukraine, and I don't think that Ukraine can afford to have that many. And of course, at the end, there is a need for clarifying the distribution of power between the state institutions, between the president, the parliament, and the government, because it's not sufficient clarity about this in the current constitution.
And everything should be done in the constitution?
It must be stated in the constitution what kind of country you want to have, and there needs to be a broad consensus on it, which also people can understand and support. I mean, if you don't have a constitution which is being accepted as a platform for political work and political competition, if you don't have a constitution which clearly says what are the powers of the state institutions, then you get a mess. And this is what we have seen actually in the past for Ukraine, that there is not sufficient clarity about all this in the constitution, and much of it is actually from the communist time.
Some days ago, the Venice Commission made a statement that Ukrainian new law, this so-called lustration law, should be more delicate with judicial system. It was stated. What does the Venice Commission mean by that?
Well, I think there are two points which are important in that respect. It is to define more clearly or the criteria for lustration. And then there has to be clear that each of those who are affected by this law have the right to appeal to a court. This is a basic principle in any democratic society based on rule of law, that you have the right to go to a court with a decision made by the authorities.
If I understand correct, the Venice Commission now offers to stop this lustration law before it will be modernized in some way. Why should, from the point of view of Venice Commission, this be stopped?
I don't think that the Venice Commission has said that it should be stopped, but it should be modified on some points. And the authorities here are now looking into the recommendation from the Venice Commission and are willing to modify it on the main points that have been made from the Venice Commission. We are not setting dates. This is because we are working in a very strict legal way, and we respect fully the independence of Ukraine, and that the state bodies here have the right to make their own decisions. We can only make recommendations and give advice And happily, all the authorities here are listening to our advice. I have my own special representative working in the Verkhovna Rada on a daily basis, and they take into account all the advice that are coming from us. I'm glad to say that it was said clearly by the Prime Minister now, and by others also. I heard that they are looking into the opinions of the Venice Commission on this concrete law.
How long will this process of modernization or reformation of constitution and other laws like lustration law, how long will this process will take, in your opinion?
On certain point, it's urgent to move speedily. For instance, on what is said in the Constitution about the judiciary and the prosecutor general. And of course, with regard to decentralization of power, because that is about implementing the Minsk agreement. If one wants, for instance, to have this, implement this decentralization of power to Donbass region, and if one wants to have local election there, it must be based on Ukrainian's constitution and Ukrainian electoral law. I find it totally, it has to be very clear that what's going to happen there must be based on Ukrainian constitution and Ukrainian laws. And that's why it's so urgent now to move forward on this on the Ukrainian side, so that Ukrainians themselves can decide the destiny of their own country. This is the only way to secure that Donbass becomes a real part of Ukraine and not a separate enclave in Ukraine. It's good to see that today there is on the table in the Verkhovna Rada a law on defining the boundaries of the Lugansk-Donetsk region, which is of course a precondition for implementing the necessary decentralization and having local elections. Because if you don't have the geographic boundaries, then you cannot do anything. So I think on the Ukrainian side, one has moved speedily and in conformity with the Donetsk, with the Minsk agreement.
But the point is, Ukraine cannot hold election there until Ukraine has no Ukrainian flags there, Ukrainian authority there, authority which could help or provide a clear election. Perhaps you do see some ways out of it.
If there is a political will on all sides, it is a way out of it. But I see also the difficulties that you are mentioning. A precondition for having elections in this region is that there is a law on how it shall be conducted, and that international organizations have the possibility and have the right to oversee these elections. So there has to be some preconditions on the ground for having fair and free elections. I see all the difficulties, but if there is a will, I think that we can do it. But for the time being, many things are unclear.
A part of lustration law, a part of constitutional changes. What else are you talking about with Ukrainian government, Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. President tomorrow?
We have talked about the human rights strategy, which the government wants to launch, and I required about when it can be foreseen. I heard today that it will now come in the spring. This is very important to have a strategy on how to implement all the obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights. And then we have talked about the situation for all the IDPs. This is, of course, a great concern for us. Humanitarian and human rights issue, 1 million IDPs. How are going to deal with this, and I have said clearly to the Prime Minister today that there is a strong need for international solidarity on this. Ukraine cannot cope with this alone. There has to be a concerted action from all the European nations.